Hello. It's Thursday, so I'm coming out with a new video about different filmmaking tips. And lately I've been focusing on visual language and visual aesthetics. So I wanted to kind of run through the rest of these concepts before moving on to different tips. Last week we talked about space and line and shape, and today we're going to talk about tone and color. So buckle up. These concepts are coming from my former professor from USC, Bruce Block, who's the guru of visual aesthetics and wrote it all up in this amazing book called The Visual Story. As I mentioned last week, each chapter, which focuses on a different basic visual component, has a list of movies that you can watch to see these components in play and like how they work to help tell the story. And that's really the key component about all of this stuff is that they help to tell your story. So that's kind of why I find this so amazing. And really, once you start seeing it and start making those choices for yourself, I think it really helps improve your work and communicating to your audience and all that stuff. So these are, again, the basic visual components: space, line and shape, tone, color, movement, and rhythm. We talked about space and line and shape last week. This video focuses on tone and color, and I plan on doing movement and rhythm. All right, tone is not the tone of the movie, whether it's happy or sad or angry, or anything to do with audio or sound qualities, like the tone of the ambience or the tone of the soundtrack, nothing like that. It certainly can convey or help to convey these qualities, and we'll look at a couple of examples. But essentially, what tone is in the visual component world is a range of brightness that we reference as the grayscale. So how much white and how much middle gray and how much black and kind of every shade of gray in between exists within the movie. Now, you may be wondering, like, well, movies are not in black and white anymore. So how does this affect anything? And to that I say tone still exists in color movies. And we'll again look at some examples. So, for example, here's a shot from Cries and Whispers, and you can see this very kind of deep red and this white. And so immediately, if I ask you, what's the tone of this image, you would say, oh, well, obviously there's some white there. But then where does the red fall in the grayscale, And so if we take this image and we turn it black and white, you can see that that red goes very dark. And when you look at what the range is or what components of tone exist in this frame, you see that it has obviously white, all this white here. It has a little bit of kind of lighter gray kind of in the background, but really not very much. This all kind of is very close to the white. And then all the rest of it is very dark. It's in this kind of latter bottom quadrant of the grayscale. So we're missing kind of middle gray. And so what we're looking at is what we would call a high contrast shot because it's got white and it's got black and it's got very little in between in terms of tone. So when you look at a shot like this, and these are again choices that you can make to help tell your story, does your story need to be told in a high contrast shot? And these are choices that you can make with wardrobe, setting, the colors you choose, which we'll talk about in a second, and all of that stuff. So tone exists even though we're shooting in color. That grayscale still exists and it still resonates and it still helps to tell your story. So here's another example. We saw this when we were talking about framing. It's a shot from the King's Speech, and if you look at it, you're kind of like, well, it's kind of like murky. And because of the colors and everything, it's probably easy to see that, oh, well, it's probably all middle gray. There isn't really anything that goes totally black, and there's certainly no white. There's no bright white. And you can see that in this black and white version of the image. And so, what is this telling us? This character kind of exists, at least in this moment, in this very kind of murky, gray middle ground, where he's kind of stuck. And then we talked about in the framing about how he's kind of crushed down into that lower quadrant in the rule of thirds, that again, this is a very kind of like suppressed character, a character that's very stuck in this moment and needs to change, but is kind of like overwhelmed by everything that's going on. So this tone works really well to help tell this story. Another example, famously so, the lighting in The Godfather has been talked about a lot, and the fact that they didn't do any highlights to create this more kind of skeletal look in the characters. So if we turn that black and white, there certainly is some middle gray here, but again, it kind of lends itself more to the peaking of the white on his collar here. And it is overwhelmingly a dark image with just this kind of hint of white. It's almost like they've reversed the shadows or ratios that we often see, where like the image is largely bright, but then there's kind of that chiaroscuro, like 3/4 shadow on the face. They've kind of reversed that here. For again, to help kind of tell this story about a man in a community that lives largely in this kind of darker, shadowy realm, and again, feels a lot more high contrast than something that has any kind of middle ground. This is not really a middle ground character. Big Lebowski, this is, a comedy, a Coen Brothers movie. As you can see, there's black in the bowling balls and there's white in the lights, and overwhelmingly, this is a brighter image. So you wouldn't be surprised to see that. And you can really see the full range of grayscale here. There's kind of everything in between. So again, it really just depends on the story you're trying to tell, the overall feeling that you're trying to convey. And again, as soon as you capture an image, set your camera down and start recording, you have captured tone, whether you're shooting in color or not, whether you want to or not, you have captured it. So you want to be able to be in control of those choices, because again, the lighting of the Big Lebowski is not going to be the right kind of lighting for Godfather. So you want to be able to make sure that your story looks and feels consistent with the visuals that you're using. So that's kind of an overview of tone, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we get into color. There are a variety of choices that you can make for the color and how to use color in your projects. And just as an overview before we dive into it, there's the color temperature of the light and how light looks in your image, and we'll talk about that. There's the kind of truth of the color system and how colors work together. And then there's the language that we use in talking about color and color choice, especially when we're talking to our wardrobe people or production design people or our DPs about what color and exactly which color we want for the costumes and the props and the walls and all that stuff. And that is hue, brightness, and saturation. Um, and we'll go into the details of this in a second because it can get kind of confusing. All right, so color temperature. We all know that white light isn't actually white. It is a rainbow of colors, and those are different wavelengths of light that combine to create white light. But what's actually turning it white really is the human eye. We are white balancing in our brain over and over and over again, depending on the different light sources. So when you're inside your house and you have a lamp on, you're not seeing the more yellowish color of that light source. Similarly, when you are outside and there is a lot more blue and kind of violet color from the sun, you're not seeing light as blue. It just looks white because our brain is taking that information and kind of adjusting to normalize it so that we're not walking around in this crazy color scheme world. And your cameras can do the same. And so this is where your choice in what lights to use and how you white balance your camera affects the color of your image. So there are a variety of different lighting sources, including the sun and then electric lamps that you can use. Uh, and those all run at different light temperatures measured by the Kelvin scale. And so you can see a range here. And so you can see down here, if anybody's seen Barry Lyndon, it was largely lit by candlelight, and candles are very low on the color temperature scale in this kind of reddish orange color temperature. And so, you have to kind of choose, and especially with that film, it was shot on film, which only had two color temperature ratings, tungsten or daylight, and so you kind of it was difficult to adjust without extra filters and things like that. So things to kind of think about. We also have, ugly fluorescent light, and it might be a cloudy day, and all of this stuff, if you don't correct for it, can give a color to the image. And, this especially comes into play when it comes to skin tone and whether that looks healthy or not. So these are all things that you can choose to correct for or choose to leave in play because that's the look and the feel that you're going for. So generally, the industry standard is, between tungsten and daylight. But again, we've got a variety of things, and we've got gels and filters and things to adjust for essentially any color temperature. But this is, I think, a great image because it kind of showcases the clear differences if you have a mixed light setting. So as you can see, there is a lamp up above and on the side of the wall here that is giving off tungsten lighting. It's a light bulb, it's a electric light, so it is going to be in this yellower, warmer color temperature range. But then we also have a window, and daylight is streaming in through that window. And what's fun or confusing about this image is that the side that looks blue is actually balanced for tungsten. So it's making the white of the lamp actually register as white to the camera. And so then we're seeing the blue because the blue hasn't been canceled out by the white balancing. We're seeing that overwhelming blue from the sun come through the window. Whereas it's the opposite on the orangey side, we have balance so that the light coming in through the window, that daylight, is white. And so then the overwhelming orangey color of the tungsten lamp is seen. So when you have mixed lighting settings, this is where you need to kind of figure out uh, whether you want these overages to come through and be seen, or Do you want to correct for it? And there are ways to correct for it. You can put a gel on the window so that the daylight streaming in, it hits, an orange color temperature gel and then has an orangey look to it. So then everything looks white and we don't have any color in the lighting at all. Vice versa, you can also replace the light bulbs with a daylight temperature light bulb, and or even put gels, or different things that you can do. So again, do you want any kind of color when it comes to the lighting of your film, or do you want the lighting to be white and the color comes through in other ways? So the color temperature of the lights and which lights you use and how you correct for any differences or mixed color temperature is one choice that you can make in how you tell this story. And then talking about color and how it's going to connect with your story and characters, we want to make sure that we're all kind of talking about the same thing. And so typically, this is what we call, the color wheel, and this is where we choose the hue of the color we want. So do we want something that's red, or do we want something that's yellow or blue or magenta or green, or something kind of in between? And where on the color wheel does this color fall? Do you want it to be orange? Do you want it to be more uh turquoise? Where on this color wheel do you want? So we're talking about hue. I just realized my little window is blocking the title. So hue, that's what we're talking about here. And you can see I've drawn a triangle in between these things and labeled them primary colors. And this is, I think, one of the hardest things for people to accept, is that we've all been taught through mixing paint in preschool and coloring and things like that, that our primary colors were red, yellow, and blue, and yellow and blue made green, and all this stuff. And when it comes to light and the physical properties of light, this is actually not true. Red plus blue plus green is what creates white light. And if anybody is old enough to have had an old TV that had little dials on it, they were RGB dials. And many of the cords that we have plugging in, again, this is kind of older technology, are RGB cords, red, green, blue. Those are our primary colors because they added together create white, and then can also, it added in different combinations, can create any other color on the color wheel. So this is kind of an important reframing, and I've literally seen it done where, if you set up a red light and a green light and a blue light and have them intersect, it becomes white. Now, this is what we call the additive color system. Now, you might be familiar with a version of this, which is actually called the subtractive color system, where the primary colors are magenta, yellow, and cyan. And those are the ink colors that we get for printing. So in all of our color printers now, we're using cyan, yellow, magenta ink cartridges to create color. And most of the time, the color that we're creating is black, so we also have black ink. But the subtractive color it's the same theory, it's just kind of flipped, where when you add magenta and cyan and yellow together, they create black. So I learned it this way with the additive color system as opposed to the subtractive color system. But again, they are the same principle, just talking about things in kind of the reverse order. So in the additive color system, red and green make yellow. And I know you're like, but that's not how it worked in preschool. And I get it. It it is a little mind blowing, but the physical properties of light, this actually is true. And then red and blue make magenta, and then green and blue make cyan. So this is the additive color system, and then all three, again, as I said earlier, create white. So why is this important? It has to do with saturation, and we'll talk about this in a minute. But figuring out what is your hue, how do they complement each other. Another thing that's important is understanding kind of where things fall again on the color wheel, where opposite colors can create a lot of contrast. And we've talked about this a little bit briefly in the last video, where contrast creates a more intense image. And so if you want things to all look and feel the same, you're going to pick colors that all kind of fall together. So if we go back to looking at the King's Speech, all these colors are kind of somewhat, similar. They're, some of them fall on different places on the color wheel, but it's a very muted contrast, so this all has what we call affinity in the color. And so if you want to choose things to have a more dynamic, intense image, or to showcase something different about your characters, where colors fall on the color wheel and how they interact is an important part of your choice. And again, we'll look at some examples of this in a second. So the other thing to talk about is brightness and saturation. So oftentimes these get confused. We'll talk about kind of a really dark red, but what we're really talking about is a very saturated red. So if you remember that Cries and Whispers image with that deep red in the wall, that red was, kind of around here, somewhere in between these, but it wasn't on the grayscale. It was fairly dark. But it wasn't necessarily the darkest red that you can get. So brightness and darkness have to do with where they fall on that grayscale. The tone of the color is whether it's bright or dark. And then saturation has to do with kind of how much pigment has been added at that grayscale level. So you can see that the most saturated that you can get, and there becomes a level where it just can't get any more saturated at this grayscale, is this orange color up here. But then as you darken it, it gets more and more burgundy and brown and almost black at this level. And then as you brighten it and add more white to it, it becomes very pale up here. So you have a whole range here of choices regarding the saturation and the brightness of the color that you've chosen on your color wheel. And again, a lot of us are familiar with this if you've played around with things, title, imaging, color, and, things like that, Photoshop. So these are choices that you can make, and you can actually show these to your team and say, this is the exact orange that I want for this character's wardrobe or for this particular prop. And if you can show them exactly what orange you're talking about, people see color in slightly different way. They have a reference now that knows exactly what you're going for, and then they will match that. So it's important to be able to talk about color and have a visual reference, because otherwise what you think is a dark red and what they think is a dark red might look slightly different. And you don't want to have those differences all over your film. And so what the kind of primary color has to do with, again, we talked about kind of opposites, is that a primary color plus a complementary color, like one of those, you know, combination colors, uh, those opposites that we saw on the color wheel, when they are added together as light and as pigment, they actually go towards middle gray. So the more and more that you add one to the other, they create this kind of middle gray phenomenon. And again, we've all seen this in saturation scales and sliders on Photoshop. So again, hopefully this isn't too out of the blue for you guys. But again, these choices are things that you can make for your character. So here are some examples. Wes Anderson, if you're interested in visual aesthetics, especially color, and he does limited space, so it's a slightly different approach to space, but especially color, he has some of the most well-controlled movies or color schemes throughout his movies. So this is a series of images from Royal Tenenbaums. So here is our main character, and whatever our main character is and the colors that they are surrounded by, as an audience, you're going to associate them with this character. So when we look at this character, we see it's one, the color temperature is warm, so the lighting has that warm tone, whereas you can see the windows back here where there would be daylight coming in, that looks white. So again, we've balanced for daylight so that the warmth of the tungsten lights, which we kind of see a little bit at the top here and kind of off camera, we see the yellow of that light source. So there's a warm image. He himself is wearing this warm beige coat, and there's another beige coat in the back. The curtains are also this kind of khaki beige color. There's a brownish blanket here. And then there are pops of white with the sheets and the towels. And then there's also this kind of signature red color that you see in the towels and on the blanket and in the curtains and in his shirt. And if you look at that red is exactly the same red in each one of these places. So it's not like one of them was a paler red or another was a darker red or one was more orange than red. These are all exactly the same red. So this is our character. This is who we know and how we've come to know him and what is true about this character in terms of kind of the world he lives in and how he feels. This is his father. So you can see an inverse in that color selection. The father is also in a kind of brown khaki coat. The texture of it is a little bit coarser, which is, I think, again, an interesting choice, going from this kind of cashmere look to this very coarse tweed. Definitely has a different feel, but keeping that kind of beige color creates a connection. And then the red that we saw only in small doses here and there is overwhelmingly powerful in this image. And so, again, through color, we have connected these characters that, yes, I believe this man is his father, and he has more of whatever this red signifies than the son does. Now, here's the rest of his family. His brother, who is also overwhelmingly red, but in this nylon Adidas tracksuit. Then, interestingly, the mother is not red or beige or any of that. She's this kind of light blue. And the daughter or the sister is also in that kind of blue color, but it's striped with white. And she has a red barrette in her hair. So she's not completely disassociated from the family, not like the mother, who is actually divorced from the father and now with this man in the back who is wearing a dark saturated blue coat and a yellow shirt and a lighter bow tie that complements the mother's dress. So again, you can see how the color is starting to attach itself to who these characters are, how they're related to one another, and how they relate to one another. And again, if we go back and look at the color wheel, we can see that that blue of the stepfather's jacket, that dark blue, is the opposite color of the yellow of his shirt. So we've created a big contrast just in his one outfit alone. And then red and that kind of lighter blue is also kind of in opposition. And we really don't have any magenta or green here at all. So this is the family. Here's another shot of the family where again we see this color scheme playing out. And then here are the sons of the Ben Stiller character who are also in these bright red tracksuits. So again, we're literally saying these are, you know, these are the children of this man, and they're all kind of carbon copies, and how they're all related to one another. And now in the middle of the movie, and without any kind of spoilers, I show you this image. And everybody will know something has changed because the color scheme and everything that we know to be true about this character is completely obliterated. You know, it's overwhelmingly light blue, and all of the red pops have gone. It's just this very, very blue light. So something has changed. Something has gone terribly wrong in this moment. And then afterwards, we get this. And it's a very high contrast, very bright, still have the red color and still in the same color scheme, but the world has changed a bit. And so through color choices alone, we've set up relationships to one another, and we've also helped tell this emotional change and psychological change in this character. In Punch Drunk Love, she is always in this red dress and he is always in this blue suit. And so again, it's almost like a uniform. We come to know her as this woman in this red dress. If she shows up in a black dress suddenly, the audience might think maybe somebody died, or why is she dressing up, or or if she was in a white dress, all of a sudden something would be very different if she showed up in a different color, a bright yellow, or if all of a sudden she starts dressing in blue. Is she doing that to match him? Or maybe he dresses in red to match her. So these are all, again, choices that you can make to signify who these characters are. Now, it's interesting in The Usual Suspects because they play with this, and again, without any spoilers, I'll just kind of leave you with this. This is in the opening of the film, The Usual Suspects, and you see Benicio del Toro's character here. He's in this kind of black suit with this bright red collared shirt. And this is how we're introduced to him. And he's a very interesting character. He talks in this crazy accent. And this is how we're introduced to him. And this is how we're introduced to the other usual suspects. And Gabriel Byrne over here in the kind of tan suit is the leader of these guys. But the story, after we kind of meet them, the rest of the story is told in flashbacks, and they're told by the Kevin Spacey character over here. And in the middle of the telling of this story in flashbacks, we get this image. The leader, Gabriel Byrne, in essentially the same color scheme as the Benicio del Toro character. And even though nobody says anything about this, nobody makes a big deal out of it, nothing. This is a very subtle and powerful way that the director gives us a hint that maybe the telling of this story is not correct, or something's going on with the telling of this story. And so, and this is something that I didn't even notice the first time I saw this movie. This was something that I noticed in the rewatching of it later on. And I went, "Oh my God, like of course, here are the breadcrumbs that let you know something is not right." And so these are again brilliant ways that you can choose to play around with some of this stuff. But again, you want to be intentional, because these shifts in character, if you do them unintentionally, if, like I said, if all of a sudden Emily Watson's character shows up in a yellow dress or a white dress, and it's like, and nothing has changed for her, then your audience is gonna feel a little unsettled and not quite understanding what's happening. Now, that doesn't mean that characters have to be in only one color, only, the entire time. I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying you have to choose what's true about your character and how you're going to present them. And so those are things to consider. And this is done really nicely in The Affair, where little details about wardrobe and where the props were and what's noticed in the retelling of the story are different between the perspectives. So again, things to think about. And again, the color temperature that's chosen for the lighting and the shooting can also then be manipulated or changed later on in the color grading of your film. And so in The English Patient, it's a storyline that takes place in modern day and then back during World War II. And so the color temperature is different in those timelines. So when we're in the modern timeline, we're in this kind of blue, uh, kind of bluish color temperature. And in the past, in the World War II timeline, we're in this kind of brownish Saharan desert, kind of look to it. And again, their clothing kind of matches that in both cases as well. And Steven Soderbergh does this a lot, especially in his movies like Traffic and Out of Sight, where Miami is always this bright yellow place, and New York or Detroit are always this kind of dull blue, and Mexico is this kind of brownish coffee color look. And so, it's almost heavy handed. But what's great about the color temperature, especially when you're using it to tell different timelines or different places in the world, is that anytime a shot goes to modern day in The English Patient or to New York in Traffic, you know, oh, it's blue. Okay, this is where we are in the story. Like if you blink and you kind of forget where you are in the moment, or you go out for a drink and you come back, you can still keep up with the story. So these are things that, again, are choices to make in how you tell your story, in the color and the look and feel of the world, in the color of the wardrobe, in the color of the props that they're using, all of that stuff. And so these are important choices. And here is another image from Fight Club. And pretty much all of David Fincher's movies have this kind of murky look, because he tends to be dealing with characters that are in this like morally gray area. And again, if you think about that tone, where does this fall on the tone scale? We have dark, we have white, uh, but it's kind of this yellow green color. So it is kind of, it has a lot of grayscale, but even though it has some touches of light and dark, it's mostly in this kind of muddled gray area. And then again, the color is very specifically chosen in terms of the look and feel of this film. So it works for the stories that he's telling. And if all of a sudden it changed and it was bright and blue and people were wearing pink, we'd be like, what's happening? How did Fight Club turn into Barbie? You know, it's a very different look and feel to it. So, again, these are choices to make in terms of how you visualize and tell your story, what's happening in the story, how to use these tools to be more effective in telling your story, because all of this stuff is subconscious to your audience. They shouldn't know it consciously, but they should feel it subconsciously. And again, like that moment in the Royal Tenenbaums where all of a sudden it goes very blue and you're like, oh, something's happened, you know, or in the switch of the color temperature of the English Patient where, okay, now we're in the past and now we're in the present, and how do these timelines talk to each other? All of those things help orient your audience and understand who these characters are, where they are in the story, and keep you following along. So, I hope that was helpful.